Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature and concepts in current media. I'm the author of 5 books on philosophy, known as the Detmar-Haskell Dialogues, and I've written books on the nature of aesthetics, the nature of ethics, the nature of truth, the philosophical equations of economics, and the nature of the political left and right. And this week, we're going to talk about the Somali Minnesota fraud. And previous broadcast, we talked about why it can happen. And now we're going to talk about a solution, how to prevent it in the future. So, how are these immigrants allegedly able to do this fraudulent act against the government? What makes the criminal be able to make up schemes against the government and extract millions or tens of millions, maybe even billions from the government welfare programs? How is it possible? Well, it is possible to stop corruption and fraudulent activity against the U.S. government and the state government. Well, how is it possible? Well, luckily, you are tuned in to the Philosophical Angle Show. And so let's delve into it and find out what the answer is. Well, the first thing we need to do in this discussion is, how are the two entities different? First, how is a private enterprise constructed, and how is it different from that of the government entity? And we have to know this because one is being constantly fooled and made fun of, and the other one is not. So the primary difference is within the transaction that happens at a private enterprise and the transaction that happened with government enterprises. And we need to discuss this because we know that corruption against a government is much easier than doing criminal activity against a private company. So let's discuss the difference. First, there is a normal economic transaction, such as when you go into a store and buy a tube of toothpaste, or anything else for that matter. What do? Well, you bring your money up to the counter and you give the cashier your money, and the cashier allows you to take away your tube of toothpaste. It's an exchange. It's an exchange where you sacrifice your money, which came from your sacrificing your information and your knowledge, your time, your effort, and sometimes material, where applicable, in an atmosphere of risk to receive a reward. And the reward also is a service, whether it's a service or product, it is made up of risk, information, knowledge, time, effort, and sometimes material. The two are swapped, and when your sacrifice is small and the reward appears to be large, the motivation entices you to go ahead and do the transaction and to receive your reward. And the government entity may also do the same thing, paying money, which is made up of your risk, your time, your effort, your information and knowledge, and material to buy a reward that it might need for whatever purposes, such as, well, for the government, it might be air defense or weapons or whatever it is that they require. But as in this case, sometimes the government entity doesn't deal directly with the provider of the reward that it intends to procure. In this case, the government intends to deliver welfare payments. And when it does, this changes things a great deal in the transaction. The transaction now is the government takes its money, which it receives from the taxpayer, and then pays it out to a government agency or to an NGO, non-governmental organization. And when it does this, the information knowledge portion of the transaction changes. The reason why this is important is that freedom is the creation of a priority and then the effectuation of a priority. And a priority is something you have decided or established in your mind that you need to do something which is a piece of knowledge. The problem with this is that when you exchange something with another person with whom you cooperate, you provide your money, which you made from your sacrifices, usually called work, to achieve and receive a reward, your take-home pay. The salient point here is that when you exchange something with another person with whom you cooperate, you are providing your money made from the sacrifices you made at your job. But in the government situation, whereby welfare is being attributed to some group of people, the priorities that should be of the taxpayer are being supplanted due to the politicians intervening with their particular priorities, eliminating the freedoms of the taxpayer. So, in this case, it may be possible that there is collusion between the priorities of the politicians involved and the priorities of those receiving the largesse, or largesse, I pronounce it largesse, in the form of welfare payments of some sort. But the money passes from the taxpayer to the coffers of the government and therefore subject to the priorities of the politicians. Then, the funds pass to a government agency, whether federal or state, and then often to another intermediary such as a non-governmental organization, usually operated by nonprofits. And then from the nonprofits, the money is distributed to the end user as a welfare payment. So we need to note that each time the funds are transferred to a new entity, the priorities change further, diminishing the freedoms of the taxpayer who made the original sacrifice that includes their original set of priorities. In a private transaction, these are the only two sets of priorities. The first set of priorities is inside the decision to sacrifice your time, effort, knowledge, and an atmosphere of risk to obtain a reward. The second set is on the other side of the transaction with the person with whom you are cooperating to make a swap of sacrifices and rewards. But this is not the case in welfare, where there are several layers of entities and different priorities, all of which stir the pot in the creation of corruption. It is no longer a transaction whereby the taxpayer gives up his money to receive a cerebral knowledge that he's giving some charity. So, how do we avoid this? How do we avoid corruption in the future? It's rampant now. In Engel's first law of the universe, if it happens once, it happens again. Therefore, corruption is not only in Minnesota, but we will find the same thing happening elsewhere in the United States, whereby tens of millions of dollars are being stolen from the taxpayer and used for non-welfare purposes. The only way to stop this corruption between provider of welfare funds, the taxpayer, and the receiver of welfare is first by eliminating the intermediaries, which procreate the corruption and the criminal activity. With all these intervening entities, the priorities have changed so much that corruption is possible. Therefore, these interim entities must be eliminated, and the whole transaction must be formulated to be similar to, or in essence the same thing as that which is in a private transaction, such as all the transactions that people make with companies that produce products and services. These transactions have very little corruption about them. So the only way to fix this problem is twofold. First is to have the welfare go through a private utility entity that exists to make a profit. I know, horrors, profit, but it will be without corruption. Secondly, the taxpayer, through its private surrogate entity, needs to receive a due reward for its sacrifice, also known as the money it provided. That is, the welfare recipient needs to supply the utility company with a reward. In other words, the Clinton presidency era policy of work for welfare must be revisited. Here's how I suggest it be structured. A company be created along the lines of a private utility whereby the profit is capped at, say, 10%, which is a standard norm for a private corporation. In addition to the U.S. government, private investors may invest in this enterprise utility. Let's call it the U.S. Welfare Utility Company. It will receive money from the U.S. government. Then the private utility will disseminate the funds directly to the recipients that apply to it and qualify for assistance. The recipients then become employees of the USWUC and therefore must work at the various jobs that may be required of these employees. These employees, formerly welfare recipients, could be loaned out to various nonprofits who might need extra help for the various good deeds that they execute for society, such as goodwill and others. Upon completion of these two actions, establishing a utility corporation to administer welfare and requiring work for welfare, corruption will be eliminated. Thanks for participating, and we'll see you next time.